Oliver, thank you for joining me today. It's a real honour to have you join us and talk about the man behind the mask.
My pleasure, and thank you very much indeed for coming, and thank you for having me.
First of all, you've led organisations through immense challenges and achieved remarkable outcomes. How would you describe the mask that you have worn as a leader, both in the military and beyond?
Yeah, that's a really good question to start with, Steve. I think we agreed when we spoke about today that it would be free flowing, and so I don't know the exact direction that it's going to go in, but you did say that the mask concept was at the heart of it, and so I've had the opportunity before coming together with you today to think about that, and I think I've come up with really two answers, which are slightly different and perhaps almost even a little bit paradoxical. I mean, in the first instance, my perhaps rather conceited reaction was, I don't think I do have a mask. And I think that one of the reasons, I very much hope at least, that I've been at least modestly persuasive to follow over the years is that I deliberately haven't worn a mask. I think at the heart of leadership, particularly senior leadership, but actually at all levels, needs to be transparency and authenticity and the real you, as opposed to a contrived version of you. And I think that really matters. I think if you are contrived, as I remember somebody saying when I went through Royal Marines officer training many 30 years ago now, that those who lead you, follow you, will realize that your leadership is not authentic. And I fully subscribe to that. So in that way, I don't think there is a mask, but in another way, I think that there is. I suspect people at work who have worked with me, who've worked for me, or who I've worked for over the years, wouldn't recognize certain of the characteristics that I have. I think they would view me as probably extremely self-confident. Privately, I'm not at all. I have vast amounts of self-doubt and constantly think that I should have done X or Y or Z better. And I fret about both the past and the future. I don't think they would necessarily see that. I think leadership is, particularly if you view it as I do, and I don't mean this at all in a pious way, but I genuinely, in my heart, view it as service. And that can mean that you care almost too much, and that can debilitate you, and that can make sleep elusive, that can make life harder than otherwise it should be if you were a bit more detached and a bit less warm-blooded and a bit less heart on your sleeve. And so I think on reflection there are a number of things that I probably do wear a mask over, but in the main I think I'm pretty open and authentic and transparent. I should add that again on reflection, that the few areas over which I do wear a mask, let's say on X day I'm feeling particularly low or not quite up for the fight as I normally would be, there are people who work with me who I would always feel capable of telling that. And so there are some people, what I call my nearest and dearest, a phrase I inherited from somebody else many years ago, those right in your leadership inner sanctum, from whom I withhold nothing. And consequently, there is no mask with them whatsoever. And they absolutely know where I am at any particular point in time. But having considered it and initially thought, no, I never wear a mask, I accept that in certain circumstances I do.
Wow, and yeah, that makes sense. I love what you said about authenticity, because you will get found out. And I don't doubt, having met you, that through your great leadership, that you do worry, because if you didn't worry, you wouldn't care. And I know
That's right.
I know that you care, passionately about the things that you do, because I know otherwise you wouldn't do them.
Well, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
in one sense it's debilitating, in another sense it makes you better.
Yes.
And I've always viewed leadership as, I'm sorry to put my cards on the table. I don't know about you, but I am absolutely mad keen on sport. So I can watch pretty much any sport and I instantly have an interest in it and an affinity with it. I've never been a high jumper myself, but if you watch the Olympic high jump, there's a remarkable thing about it, which is that the person who has won, i.e. they're about to be crowned the gold medalist, they are the greatest in their discipline on earth, nobody has matched them. The way the competition works is they keep jumping until they've knocked the bar off 3 times, because they're always going after that extra centimetre.
Yeah.
And I think that's how leadership is. And so it weighs quite heavy on your shoulders because you're always trying to be better. Why? Because you have this, and I don't think this is too strong a word, you have this sacrosanct responsibility for other human beings. And if that doesn't weigh quite heavily on your shoulders, I'm not sure you're in the right job.
Yeah, it makes total sense, and you're right. You have to care and you have to serve to be a great leader. I think that anyway.
I think it's very, very hard to lead otherwise, because I just don't think it can't be contrived or artificial, as we were just discussing. But I don't think that your people will follow effectively and be at their best unless they feel profoundly cared for and well looked after by you. What you'll end up with there is a kind of transactional relationship on the basis of rank, status, seniority, pay, all of those things that simply are irrelevant. People will do what they're told because they want to attract a salary at the end of the month, but they won't be at their best.
No. People who know me know that my favourite phrase is nobody cares what you know until they know that you care. And then you'll get the more people will follow you because you care, not just because of what you know. Yes,
that's a brilliant way of putting it. And it's similar to one of my favourite quotes, and forgive me, this is, I'll quote it directly.
It's a quote off.
But it could be, it clearly in this day and age, it would have women also included in it, so it would be gender blind, but it's a Second World War quote, and it says, a man may have authority over others, but he cannot have their heart but by giving his own. And I think that's absolutely at the heart of it.
Absolutely, yeah, that is so true. And you're right, it is gender neutral.
Yes, it could be anybody.
It could be anyone.
And all over the place now, there are, many of whom I've worked with, there are incredible female leaders. And I think that's all to the good.
Yeah, that quote is definitely better than mine. I'm going to note it down. Leadership often comes with expectations of strength and resilience. So how have societal views of masculinity influenced the way you have approached roles and responsibilities?
Yeah, I think the straight answer to that, it's a good question. Let me just think about it a moment. I mean, I think the straight answer to that, I haven't felt particularly pressured or influenced by societal perceptions. And I suppose that goes some way to explaining some of the more difficult decisions that I've made in my career, which wouldn't necessarily have been favoured by reasonably large groups of people. Because I think leadership is, we go back to the authenticity point, and I don't think one can feel authentic or can, much more importantly, be authentic if one is concurrently being influenced by wider factors. So I haven't felt unduly pressured or influenced by the expectations or perceptions of society around me. But I would accept that there is an expectation which I have sought to live up to, but partly because I think as a leader you have to try and do this, that you do need to be resilient and relatively strong, particularly when the going gets tough, because you become the kind of flame around the moths, around which the moths, being your people, can coalesce when the going gets extremely tough. And that's a level of pain that you have to take, because if it is truly about service leadership, when the going gets very, very hard, you have to be something of a totem for your people. That doesn't mean that you need to be holier than thou or perfect or able to do it all or able to carry everything on behalf of everybody. It's a team game, but there is also something quite fundamental about being the senior leader.
Yeah.
And I think in difficult circumstances, that therefore means I don't really view this as a societal expectation. I view it as an expectation of myself, that at that moment in time, or those moments in time, when the weather turns a bit foul and the going gets really tough, you actually do have to stand up. It's your job, it's what you're paid for. And I think that's non-discretionary. I think leaders have to understand that. And I think, a poor brand of leadership is when the going gets tough and the senior leader goes missing.
Yeah, and then it all goes very quiet at the top.
That's exactly right. Because it's an interesting exercise, this, that much of the time as a senior leader, you are trying to, how would I best express this, Steve? You're almost trying to do yourself out of a job, because you're trying to make everybody else brilliant at what they do. You're trying to give them that confidence, that safety, that latitude, that inspiration to be at their very, very best. And if they're all at their very best, they'll all be better than you and they won't need you. So much of the time you're trying to make yourself redundant almost until something really seriously goes wrong.
Yeah.
And then it is interesting, and I have experienced this, it is interesting how quiet the room goes and how all the eyes turn to you. And that's what you're paid for. At that moment in time, you have to stand tall. And if at that moment critique you are unable to do so, then I don't think you're fulfilling your obligations in full.
No, that makes total sense. No, yeah, I've seen it before where leaders have gone quiet to the top and then, they're soon replaced.
Yeah, I mean maybe, and then that's certainly one way that it plays out, and the other way that it plays out is that their people lose confidence in them, and that's very sad.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's often you'll be able to remind me the all great plans, fall apart
In the face of the enemy.
in the face of the enemy. That's it.
And it doesn't have to be the enemy in traditional military terms,
No.
just in the face of any difficulty.
Of course.
Because what happens is, it's an interesting cultural dynamic which again I've experienced on a number of occasions, that when an organisation is placed under massive stress, as opposed to the normal days when it's just kind of normal jogging and the cadence is what everybody is accustomed to, when the real stress and the real pressure comes on, that is the moment when leaders are needed. And if they become less than visible at that point, it's problematic.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, in your career, you've been celebrated for your moral courage and ethical leadership. Do you ever feel the pressure to maintain the facade of unwavering confidence, even in the face of personal or professional challenges?
Yes, I think the straight answer to that question, Steve, is yes. I think that if you are prepared, which I am, to travel a relatively unusual path and try imperfectly and with all kinds of failures along the way, but try genuinely and authentically extremely hard to do the right thing. And at the heart of doing the right thing lies moral courage. It's that great quote from the wonderful general from the Second World War here, the Lost Army in Burma, Slim, who says, without courage there are no other virtues, because it is the virtue that unlocks all the rest. And I think he's completely right in what he says there. And if you are prepared to demonstrate that, on occasions it is extraordinarily lonely.
Yeah.
And you are quite literally pretty much alone. I can think of occasions where I have felt tantamount to completely alone. And there is therefore two things going on. You feel utterly isolated, fearful, apprehensive, anxious, worried, concerned. How will this turn out? Am I doing this as well as I should be doing it? Am I getting it right? Where am I falling short? Where have I joined the dots wrongly? And of course, at the same time, you have a public persona to adopt, which kind of goes back to your point about is there a mask or our point collectively, is there a mask or isn't there a mask? And at that point, there is a definite mask.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it is easy or wise or necessarily the right thing to do, in fact, to betray or portray those self-doubts publicly at that moment, largely because you've got a lot of people relying on you, and the kind of wonderful Napoleon quote, "A leader is a dealer in hope," comes into play, because at those moments, it's not just you, your organization, your people, those for whom you carry this astonishing level of responsibility are also having a very tough time. And if you start to imbue them with self-doubt, that's unhelpful. So the answer to the question is yes.
Yeah, no, I think that too. When we spoke before about when the buck stops with you, and everyone's looking at you, no matter what is going on in your life now, you have to instill confidence in everyone else. So that mask is super important at that point, for the greater good, if you like.
I completely agree with that. And I remember learning a big lesson on this subject. Twice, in fact. I was working for the Chief of Defence Staff. In fact, his picture's over there. A naval officer. So you would recognise it, Steve. A wonderful man called Lord Boyce. When 9/11 happened, and that was a complete game changer for him in the role that he was in. Totally unforeseen, totally unexpected. Utterly new world within which he suddenly had to operate as the most senior man in defence. And I know, because I became very close to him, that in his private times, he worried and fretted deeply whether he was equal to the task that he had so unexpectedly been set. But he didn't transmit that as he went about his job. No. He imbued people in the Ministry of Defence and more broadly across Whitehall, across the UK and across the world with a level of confidence that he was on top of this. And I think that was extremely important. And the second one, relatively shortly thereafter, was on the first night of the Second Gulf War in 2003. And 4-2 Commando, where I was in civilian language, the operations director, and my boss was the commanding officer, so the chief executive in civilian language. And there was a terrible helicopter crash on the first night, an untold tragedy. 12 people died just as we were getting going. And I know, because they were friends of his, many people in that helicopter were personal friends of his, that the commanding officer was devastated and heartbroken. But he didn't show that. He absolutely stood tall. And at a moment where his commando unit was shaken to its core, he led it into Iraq, even in the face of the greatest tragedy, sadness, difficulty, and so on and so forth. So I do think there are moments where you've actually got to put on quite a significant mask because other people are relying on you to do so.
Yeah, and I see that a lot. I agree. How do you think the public perception of someone with your accolades, military honours, leadership roles and OBE aligns or contrasts with who you are behind the scenes?
That's a good question, Steve. Probably I'd route it back to the first question you asked with regards to the mask, right at the beginning of this discussion or of this podcast. I think in the main, with me, what you see is what you get. Yeah. That is certainly how I try to be. I'm open, I'm transparent, I seek to be honest, warts and all, and people kind of, I think, do therefore get an impression of me. but I think there are things that they wouldn't see, which are, private to me, and things that happen in this house and
Yeah.
in other places where I'm able to. I don't think I'm ever not me, but somebody once gave me a piece of advice, and I'm still not completely sure that I subscribe to it in full, but I see where it's coming from, and it was to do with how you should perform in an interview, a job interview, and they said you must be you, but you don't have to be the whole you. And I think there's some sense in that to a point.
Yeah.
You can't be not you, because that's contrived. That's completely inauthentic. But you don't have to be the whole you. And so I suspect that the public perception of me would be, he's incredibly strong. He is extremely sure of himself. He has a great level of self-confidence, all of which isn't actually quite true. On occasions I feel the opposite of strong.
Yeah.
I regularly feel deeply inadequate and lacking in self-confidence, and I regularly can sense that my resilience is diminishing. But I suspect that would be lost on those other than who I know extremely well.
Yeah, no, that makes a great point. I mean, so my girlfriend's a great leveler for me. I can come across as very confident and seem to know what I'm doing. But when I get home and we're around the table in the kitchen, and I will say something, she'll say, "Well, you're not at work now." It's I know what's really going on. Tell me, talk to me about about how you're feeling. And she's a great leveler for me, and then I can let my mask down a little bit. Actually, I don't need to be, wear this mask all the time, and so I have to let that down a lot. So I don't know if it's the same in your house when you get home and you're surrounded by your kids, surrounded by your partner.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this quite a lot over the years, and also I've not done many podcasts, 3 or 4 in the past, so I'm not an expert on this landscape by any means, but I have talked about it again on previous podcasts, which is that, what keeps me going when things get tough and the job or jobs, whatever you're doing at that moment in time, risk starting to feel verging on overwhelming, is love and friendship. And it is those people in your life, and I know exactly who they are, who you can be the whole you with. Yeah. And you have the confidence, or the mutual confidence, trust, loyalty, love, understanding with those people, that you can be free of any, if you like, control mechanisms or anything along those lines. You can just be the total and the full you. And so if you're angry or sad or upset or worried or feeling down or feeling as if you failed, you can be completely open with them about that.
Yeah.
And they will, with kindness and understanding, listen to you, bolster you and support you, because they love you just as you love them.
Yeah.
And that for me is the most important thing in my life. And I know exactly who those people are. There's obviously my little family who live here. There is a slightly broader family beyond that. And then there is a small group of exceptionally close friends, some of whom I've had since school, some of whom I've had since university, and some of whom I've had who've arisen during my career. But it would be no more than a dozen people or so in total.
Wow.
And they are just cast iron, extraordinarily close relationships where you would go to the end of the world for that person, and they would do likewise for you. And when the going gets really tough, they're the people you need.
That's amazing. It's like it's a phrase I heard a while ago, that your vibe is your tribe.
That's a good phrase.
Yeah,
I've not heard that. Yeah,
and you pick your tribe. And we often get attracted, the law of attraction. We often get attracted to hopefully the right people, and then we that can help bolster us and support us, which is fantastic. So now I'd like to maybe talk more about vulnerability, or the man behind the mask. You've experienced profound professional loss, including the suicide of your youngest brother, Adrian, and others close to you. How have these tragedies shaped your understanding of vulnerability and mental health?
Yes, that's an important area. I think I've probably gained a greater understanding of it over the years.
Yeah.
When my brother died, which was at the beginning of 2003, and we were gearing up to go to Kuwait en route, of course, ultimately to Iraq, and it was an utterly, I cannot overstate this, devastating thing to happen. I had committed, he'd been very unwell for a long time, and I'd committed a lot of time and effort and love to try and keep him safe.
Yeah.
And I felt profoundly that I'd let him down, ultimately, because he died of suicide. And there is I felt an acute sense of loss, bereavement, but also, I think it would be fair to say, shame over the fact that I viewed it that I had failed. And the worst thing I did, I think, at that point in time was to absolutely, I mean, I reacted quite strongly when it first happened, and I felt acutely devastated, and various friends of mine kind of fished me out of a slightly despairing hole because I needed to go to Kuwait. I had to get on with it. I mean, I was in a pretty big, pretty influential role in a key organisation that was going to, lead or be part of the vanguard of the attack into Iraq. And I also had to work out how on earth I was going to deliver a eulogy for Adrian at his funeral, which I somehow did, and bizarrely was given a counter-anthrax jab in the wake after the funeral, because I couldn't be in 4-2 Commando that day, where I should have got the jab in the medical centre. And then literally the next day I needed to fly to Kuwait with quite a big job to do. And so I just shut it down in the back of my head and refused to allow myself to think about it. It was absolutely off limits, because I thought that if I dwelt on that, I would do my job in Kuwait and then in Iraq poorly. And I was petrified of getting that job wrong and somebody being hurt as a result of me getting it wrong. And so I had the mental ability to compartmentalize, segment, and just shut this down in the back of my head for I can't remember how long it was, let's say 4 or 5 months that I was away, which worked. And it meant that in large part, I think I managed to discharge my duties effectively in spite of this, to me, horrifying bereavement at the time. But goodness me, I've paid a price for it since, because I didn't grieve.
Yeah.
And I didn't allow myself to work it through, and I didn't allow myself to talk about it with anybody in any meaningful way, at least. And I didn't allow myself to, unpack it and get my head around it. And so still to this day, I can walk round a corner in wherever I might be at that particular point in time. Let's say I've gone to a meeting in London. I can come out of a tube station and I can walk out and I can walk round a corner of Road X, and I can see Adrian directly in front of me. And he died more than 22 years ago.
Wow.
And that's not an exaggeration, that's entirely truthful. So I think what I've learned over the years with that is that compartmentalizing this stuff and shying away from, although I have respect for myself in a way, that I had very little alternative. Yeah. Either I folded professionally or I got on with it. And I didn't want to fold professionally for obvious reasons. That would have been very sad from my perspective. But the trade-off, therefore, was to just shut the Adrian thing away completely. And I think I've learned over the years that is no good. It just doesn't work. It is corrosive and it gives you significant problems ahead. And so when things go wrong and tragedies happen, you have to be prepared to compute them in full and to get your head around them in full rather than to rather shy away from them, which is in those circumstances what I did.
So in the wake of Adrian's death, you said that you deployed very quickly to the Gulf and you didn't have time to grieve. So I'd be interested to know in how have you coped now? Have you grieved? How have you have you found peace with it all?
To a point, I think would be the straight answer to that question, Steve. I have forced myself to spend a lot more time working it all through. And I took some advice about it at one point, and I've applied some. I'm not a big cognitive behavioral person, but the CBT technique seemed to me to be pretty sensible, where you reframe it in a way that says, rather than me being ashamed and various other emotions about what happened, I actually start to celebrate the relationship that we had and all that we had shared over the years and so on and so forth. So there are different ways of looking at it. I've also been much, much more prepared to share my thoughts with others. I think that's always a good thing. I think in the face of enormous sadness, adopting the into your cave lone wolf approach is, largely speaking, unwise. It's something I'm very good at, but it's largely speaking unwise. And I speak very, very openly to anybody who wants to listen about Adrian and about why I think that mental health and particularly suicide are such profoundly important issues. One of the reasons I'm talking to you here today, one of the reasons I support another great organisation in the Northwest called Sean's Place, one of the reasons I continue to try and keep the profile of all of this up through social media. So I think there are things that one can do that, this sounds very vanilla, but that in relative terms makes it feel a bit better. But in another level, it's a level of grief that is so profound that it will never go away, and I'll take it to my grave. And there's nothing to be done about that. I'm completely reconciled to that, and in a way, I feel fortunate about that because it's an extraordinary level of love, which I was blessed to feel. It just didn't finish as it should have done. But yes, I've got better with coping with it, and I've also had to deal with others who have sadly died the same way. And I remember I'm quite often asked by people, what is the proudest thing that you've achieved in your career? And it isn't, I don't care, it isn't remotely an MBE or an OBE or the Sword of Honour or the youngest colonel. It's none of those things. They don't even feature. The one I would point to is the fact that the command tour that I led in Afghanistan on Herrick 14, quite extraordinarily, and I don't know to this day quite how this happened, but we managed to bring everybody home alive, which was viewed as tantamount to impossible. But sadly, we've not managed to keep everybody alive since. And so, those experiences have, to some extent, contextualized Adrian, because of course it's not just Adrian, and for a while I thought it was just Adrian. It certainly isn't. As we all know, it's Adrian and many, many, many others. And they have come at points in time where I've not been immediately deploying to the Gulf, and where I've had more flexibility, space, freedom to think them through and do with regards to those special people the things that I couldn't do at the time with regards to Adrian, if that makes sense.
No, it makes absolute sense. And you said that you'll probably take this grief to the grave, I think is what you said. And I think you're right. I don't think there's a time limit on grief.
No.
And anniversaries, birthdays, maybe a song that you shared or something like that, they will always come up and you'll always see that. So I think you're right in that respect. And it's also fascinating what you're saying about Obheric when you brought everybody back, and everybody saw that as a something that should have been impossible to do. You've spoken and written before about the drumbeat of suicides that have followed you through your life and career, and you've just spoken then about, sadly, you brought all the Royal Marines back, but sadly you still lost some through suicide. And how have these losses influenced your perspective on the pressure men face to suppress their emotions?
Well, I should start by saying that I have attended a funeral from somebody who died of suicide who was female and served in the army. So I think it's important that we recognise that this is not, I understand that the prevalence is particularly high in relative terms in men, but it isn't the preserve solely of men by any stretch of the imagination. And I remember that funeral with great sadness and tragedy. But to answer your question more head on than that slight caveat, or that important, not slight at all, that important caveat. Yes, I mean, I think that we're moving on the right tracks. I don't really remember this being a subject at all when I first went into the workplace. I remember going into the Royal Marines in the mid-1990s, fresh out of Cambridge University, and it being tough, challenging, pressurised, some people passing, some people failing. I don't really remember mental health being on the agenda whatsoever. No. And if you were going to start to unravel a bit, that was a place you could definitely do so. But it simply wasn't relevant. Well, it probably was highly relevant, but it wasn't viewed as such. And yet now it's by far not perfect, but goodness me, it's moved forward. I mean, look at what you're doing.
Yeah.
Look at the profile of this. Look at Sean's place that I mentioned earlier. The list goes on. I think it's fair to say, you might have a different view, Steve, with your excellent work, but I don't feel that it's taboo any longer. I don't feel that it's a dirty secret that's hidden away any longer. I do feel it is now a subject of discussion, and I think that is to be celebrated from the rooftops. I think that is unbelievably important. But there are still far too many people dying from serious mental ill health, and specifically suicide. And so I think the answer to your question is yes, people, men in particular, do continue to find it extremely difficult to share when they are feeling particularly low, and we just have to continue to work at it. I don't pretend there's a magic wand answer.
No. It is. I mean, it's very difficult for frontline troops, whether they're Marines, paras, whatever, because there's so much emphasis placed on their value and purpose as a frontline soldier to be the best of what they can do, and that camaraderie, and they're all in it together. And I find that sometimes they get deployed and they are let's say a Royal Marine commando. They're part of a group, they're part of a greater plan, they're all in this together. And then when they leave the front line, they are still, their value, their purpose is still that Royal Marine commando. And I find that they struggle to let that mask down because they feel like everyone's still looking at them to be that. So when they're feeling sad, when they're feeling low, they still can't drop that mask a lot of the time. Have you seen that?
I think that's fair. I think the camaraderie is a double-edged sword, because I think the camaraderie, in my view, is utterly magical, and it's one of the things I missed most from my time in the Royal Marines. But it is still a double-edged sword, because on one hand, the camaraderie should mean, by definition, that you can open up to and lean on anybody at any particular point in time. I mean, that's in a way inferred through the word camaraderie. But in another sense, there is an expectation. You're part of something that is, I don't like this phrase at all, but it's an inescapable reality that is somewhat alpha.
Yeah.
And it's difficult in that context to be beta on a certain day, because you don't quite fit in with the alpha sort of ethos. And I think that's something that needs to be worked at hard. So there is a double-edged sword there. And I think the downside to that magic camaraderie and that galvanizing and inspiring nature of everything that you do there is that when you leave it and you shed the scaffolding that it has provided for you physically, mentally and practically for X number of years, you are all of a sudden extremely naked.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling that in the late part of 2013. And so I have felt that when I left so completely unexpectedly with absolutely no idea what I was going to do, and a deep sense of sadness that I was walking away from this thing. I remember feeling utterly exposed, full of self-doubt, deeply anxious and very, very worried about what the future would hold, because everything I'd known professionally is suddenly stripped away.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to go through. And I think we need to continue to work, and I know lots of organisations are doing this, and in no way am I criticising them. I celebrate them absolutely, but I think we need to continue to work more and more and more on those landscapes. How do we protect people who are going through profound and potentially seriously upsetting change, of which there are many kinds, but one would be leaving the armed forces?
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. You know, the only constant is change, yet it's one of the few things that we take the time to prepare for and really look into. You're right, and I see it a lot in men in, you know, construction, manufacturing,
Well,
infrastructure.
construction is a perfect example.
Yeah, absolutely. Uniform services,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
they're often defined by what they do.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's their identity.
That's their identity, and when that changes, it's a real blow to them.
It's like a bereavement. It is a deep sense of pretty crushing personal loss, and you lose that superstructure, the scaffolding that I mentioned, that you were buttressed and supported and defined by, but you also lose to an extent a piece of your soul, and that is very, very hard to cope with, and people need a good deal of support at those inflection points.
Yeah, I totally agree. What moments or relationships have allowed you to take off the mask and process your own grief and struggles?
Yes, I mean that's easy to answer, I think, and I go very much back to a question that you posed me previously in the discussion, Steve, and it's those nearest and dearest to whom I referred. It's the small number of people, 3 of them, who live in this particular house with me when they're here. None of them are right now, but often they are. And it's a very small number of extremely close friends and family beyond that, of all kinds. So, you know, 2 of my extremely close friends who are godparents to each of our boys are the regimental sergeant majors to the RSMs I was blessed with when I was commanding 4-5 Commando. So I was the senior officer, relatively silver spoon background, two parents who were lawyers, private school education in Birmingham and then Cambridge University. They were blessed with absolutely none of that whatsoever, and came up a far, far tougher and much, much more impressive way. And yet they're two of my closest friends in the world, if not, I can't think of a closer friend, in fact, than either of them. And that's pretty special.
Yeah.
That's pretty special. And that runs very deep. And, you know, I would class them as blood brothers of mine. And so I have no difficulty taking any mask off whatsoever with them and they with me. It's relationships like that.
Yeah, I can only imagine that when you've got good people in your life like that, you get called out on your nonsense, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Totally. And they're unafraid to do so, and they know they can do so with my complete blessing.
Yeah.
And vice versa. And they're not perfect, and I'm not perfect, and we all know that. And I'd apply the same thing to a series of other people. Not huge numbers. You can't have, not in my experience anyway, you can't have huge numbers of people who are that close to you. It's kind of unsustainable. You can't really make it work, because maintaining relationships like that, of course, takes time and commitment and effort. But ultimately, what lies at the heart of them is love. Whatever the Greeks said, there are kind of 9 different kinds of love, and only one is sexual. The remaining 8 are not, and they are love that can perfectly easily be demonstrated in the workplace.
Yeah.
And I feel blessed to have those kinds of relationships, and I can think now in my head the dozen or so people that fit into that category.
Sounds great. Absolutely fantastic. So let's move on. Let's talk about maybe solutions and change, maybe redefining masculinity. Based on your experiences, what do you believe needs to change in how we view masculinity to create a culture where men feel safe expressing vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a culture. You've used exactly the right word, in my opinion, there, Steve. I don't think that there is as I mentioned earlier, I don't think there's a magic wand or a silver bullet or a perfect answer. I think we have to simply keep up the momentum of the conversation, of the, too long a word coming up, but the destigmatization, of the making this a routine part of the discussion. I remember, if I think back now, when I joined the armed forces, it was illegal to be anything other than heterosexual. That makes my skin crawl now to think of that. And partway through my service, that was changed, thank goodness. But the stigma didn't. And so it was probably 15 years after that I left the Royal Marines. And as far as I was aware, nobody had actually claimed to be homosexual, although of course many were. Statistically, that's obviously the case. So when things change, there is a long-standing hangover, and it takes a very, very long time to get to a point where it is routinely part of the conversation and has been genuinely, this is not a good phrase, but you'll understand where I'm coming from. I'm not playing it down, but it has genuinely been normalized.
Yeah.
And I think we're on the same journey with mental health, particularly with regards to men, but as I say, not exclusively applicable to men, applicable sometimes, very sadly, to women as well. And I think we just need to commit to continuing on that journey. I don't think there's a magic thing I can point to. We need to do that, and this will all be fixed tomorrow. But we are making progress, and it's the polar opposite of what I remember on entering the workforce 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And I hope if we were to wind forward another 30 years, it will just be completely normal and routine.
I agree. I mean, I see it all the time with saying that mental health is okay. And you go, yeah, well, that makes absolute sense. But it's like we've forgotten to believe that two things can be true at the same time. You know, I can be strong and masculine, okay, but I can also not be silent about how I'm feeling. You know,
Absolutely.
one doesn't diminish the other.
No,
I can believe
absolutely.
two things to be true.
I think that's exactly right, and I don't think, and I've talked about this on another podcast. I think there is no, so as long as you're not erratic or unpredictable, you don't. Your people don't want to think that 1 minute you're going to be hugging them and the next minute you're going to be screaming at them. That's not helpful. You need to be much more sort of predictable than that, I think. But I don't think there's any harm in vulnerability, none whatsoever. In fact, I think it's a very powerful leadership card to play. People who have worked for me have seen me cry. I have no problem with that, nor do I think they do. I think they realise it means they're led by somebody who really cares, who's not a robot, and who's a human being. And when things go very badly wrong, it can bring a tear to your eye. There's nothing wrong with that. It's legitimate, truthful, honest, authentic vulnerability. And so long as I say it's not over the top or unjustified or done for effect or erratic or whatever, I think vulnerability is a hugely powerful card.
I agree. So, I mean, that brings me on nicely to this. How can leaders, particularly those in high pressure environments like the military or large organizations that is male centric, model openness and emotional honesty for those they lead?
By doing exactly that. By doing exactly that. By demonstrating in full, warts and all, to include their understanding of their own weaknesses, who they are in full. What people don't want, in my experience, is to be led by a robot. Well, I'm not going down the AI road here, but metaphorically, to be led by a robot or to be led by somebody who is not prepared to show their full colours. And most people's full colours contain a range of things, some better, some worse, some in the middle, some doubtful, some confident, some sad, some happy. And I think you have to, in a workplace, you have to lead by example by normalising that completely. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody who works for me about all the things I'm extremely poor at, and about my hopes and my fears and my worries and my aspirations and my sadnesses. I always, whenever I go to a new organisation, I say that there is a profoundly important thing to me, which is the death by suicide of my younger brother. And you need to understand that that is seared into me. And on occasions during the year, maybe on an anniversary, maybe not, I might just feel a bit blue about that. And by doing that, firstly, you're being authentic and truthful to your people, but also my hope is that you're giving them the agency to do likewise.
And it makes absolute sense. I mean, we see it in large organizations all the time that, HR teams will put out this message saying, this is what we believe. We believe vulnerability is okay. We believe that your mental health is really important. We want to really support you. But unfortunately, through the backbone of the leadership structure, they're not living what everybody else, what the HR team is saying. So therefore, the people at the bottom go, "That's not genuine.
That just doesn't work." I've seen it loads of times. You've just taken the word that I was going to use ahead of me when you said living. It's got to be lived. It has absolutely got to be lived. I've seen this in organisations whereby they seek to be disability confident, and they go through the process to be disability confident. They put a badge up that says they're a disability confident employer, and nothing changes at all. It's got to be lived. All of these things have to be lived. They can't just be, it's like values, they simply can't just be written down and then expected to magically materialise, particularly when the going gets tough. They've got to be part of the DNA. They've got to be in the bloodstream. They've got to be in the water system. They've got to be everywhere all the time. Unless it's lived, it won't happen.
No, I absolutely agree.
At the risk of sounding grand, as a senior leader who has been at the top of, in leadership terms, as the chief executive of various organisations, it starts with you. It has to. Otherwise, the tone is not set from the top.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. Because, even if your leadership team is a small circle, if that leader is then demonstrating within that small circle with the expectations that they do the same and they expand through their circle, it'll just filter through the whole company.
That's the whole point. And that's the concept of leadership shadow. So I resist this idea of, I try and flatten all these hierarchies as much as possible on the basis that, everybody in an organisation is as important as anybody else, irrespective of their rank, seniority, experience, whatever.
Yeah.
Forget all of that. But inescapably, and this is about responsibility and accountability, there is a thing called leadership shadow, which is the shadow that senior leaders are casting over all of the other people in the organisation.
Yeah.
And unless that is felt on these really challenging subjects that you're talking about, Steve, the organisation won't live it, because it will not see its leaders living it.
I love that. I love that idea of the leadership shadow. I absolutely love it. And if at the hardest times, if the shadow is its smallest, that is when you're not having impact.
Yeah, that shadow can be warm as toast, and it can be absolutely inspiring to everybody beneath it, or it can be freezing cold and they can all be shivering.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. You've built a career on trust, culture, and performance. How can these principles be applied to reshape the narrative around emotional or mental health and masculinity in society?
Well, I kind of think they're all trump cards in their own right.
Yeah.
I don't believe that any really positive, persuasive and inspiring culture can derive other than from, at least in part, being based on trust. And I don't think that you gain performance unless you have a really powerful culture. So I think they're inextricably linked. They're all multiple sides, not just two sides of the same coin. And so I think all three of those things, plus various others probably, courage, the preparedness to be vulnerable, authenticity, visibility, transparency, I think all those things are needed to continue to drive the profile of this vital conversation.
I agree. I love what you're saying about them both being trump cards. If you've got a culture from the top down, bottom up, and you're living that, you can, that trust will just grow. That it doesn't matter,
That's right.
Whether it's an emotional problem, a mental health problem, a physical problem. If that trust is there, then I can speak up.
Yeah, and you will never obtain a positive, powerful, warm, safe culture that enables people to speak openly and freely in the knowledge not only that they can do so, but that they will genuinely be listened to and their thoughts will be borne in mind, and they can do so without fear or favour. That is impossible without trust. Won't happen, doesn't exist.
Agreed.
So trust is the kind of, the seed at the heart of the whole thing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I see it all the time in men in male-centric spaces, and they have these great opportunities to demonstrate vulnerability, but because they don't trust how people are going to respond to them,
Right.
and they
Hide their light under a bushel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's real.
Or they say what they think people want them to say.
Yes.
Rather than speaking freely. And I've seen this. And I won't necessarily name and shame it, but one of the organisations that I've inherited as the chief executive over the years was entirely falling into that trap, that people were expected to speak out but did not feel safe to do so because of an absence of trust, a trust deficit.
Yeah.
And that won't work.
Agreed. Wow. Okay, finally, last question. What gives you hope for the future? how do you envisage a world where men can thrive without the burden of the mask?
Yeah, that's a good way to finish, Steve, and thanks for asking. I mean, by nature, although I have my moments of feeling, not quite like this, and we've discussed this a good deal during this podcast work. Largely speaking, I am hopeful and I am an optimist by nature. I am, cup half full rather than a cup half empty person. At least I think the significant majority of the time. I am hopeful about this, genuinely so. I think the conversation has moved a million miles in the 22 years since my brother's death. Yeah. I think the conversation has moved another million miles above and beyond that in the 30 years since I entered the workplace. So I am hopeful. I think we're on the march here. I think this is becoming part of a reasonably normalised conversation now. I think people are on the lookout, trying to move this forward, trying to contribute to it. I think it's viewed as important. I don't think it's stigmatised anything like to the extent it was. It's far more part of the core discussion and narrative about professional and personal life these days, and the obvious intersection between those two things. I don't see that changing. I see real momentum here. I'm not saying this to make you blush, but through the work of people like you and many others in your space. So I think we're on the move, and I think that is a cause for confidence and optimism and hope ahead. Long may it remain that way.
Well, that's great, and I think you're right. There is a movement happening.
There is a movement.
There is a movement happening, and I think we're on track. And so, a massive thank you for joining us today for Man Behind the Mask. It's been inspiring. I feel 10 foot tall. So, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And
well, as I said to you, Steve, I mean, I'm happy to support all that you're doing and your organisation in any way I can. So, thank you for inviting me, and thank you very much for coming today.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Bye bye.